one. I was going to say good morning, but good afternoon, everybody. No mai, haere mai, and welcome to AMA's online events. So you may have been to a number of sessions already, or you might just be chiming in now. So I will quickly go through a couple of things that we like to happen in these, and then I'm going to introduce and pass over to our wonderful speaker. Okay, so hopefully you can find the chat. There's a little logo of it there if you're struggling. We would love it if you could just write in a quick little message about maybe where you're from or what you're up to. It's always nice to see. During the session, feel free to post questions in the chat too, and myself and Anna will try to address those at appropriate times. But it is great if you can leave your mic on mute. And there might be times where we do ask you to talk, but in general, keeping your mic on mute would be awesome. We are recording this session, so you can watch it again, and some other people may choose to watch it on YouTube later as well. So we have a wonderful session. Anna Ferguson is someone you probably already know quite well, but if you don't, a very short intro from me. She's currently at University of Auckland in the stats department there, and is a very well liked lecturer, doing awesome things with their work there. And before that, she was a maths teacher, a stats teacher at Avondale College, and where our thoughts are with that school and a couple of other schools that are affected at the moment. So she did awesome things while she was in the secondary sector too, and she still continues to help us a huge amount with stuff like this that she's doing, and her awesome websites named Teaching Statistics is Awesome. So Anna is going to take over the screen now, and we're looking forward to an awesome talk.
Thank you, Jared. Let me I'll pass the waiting room over to you.
Cool.
I'll pop up here and into my slides. Okay, kia ora tātou. Everyone can see my screen, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Jared, for that intro. I will try to live up to what you just said. I am thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. I know it's already halfway through the day on a Saturday, but I guess with lockdown, I mean, where else are we going to go? But enjoy some great PD. I was at a great session this morning with Thomas Ever, talking about statistics and science and climate change. And I don't know about you, but I always find so much inspiration and ideas from all these talks that I go to, and I really appreciate the AMA putting on these sessions. So I did write this little blurb here about my talk, and I think I did the thing that you're not supposed to do, which is to maybe overpromise what your session will be about. Because when I wrote this, my head was really in the space of wanting to kind of introduce you and share with you a bunch of different, like what I call data landscapes or data ideas, data contexts to explore with your students. I had just done a talk for the US Conference of Teaching Stats, and I had gone through and looked at a bunch of ways that I was trying to offer customized data learning journeys for my students. So that was initially going to be the focus for this talk, but one of the reasons why I'm so into these data landscapes is actually from the student perspective, which is really this part here, right at the end of what I've said, which is that I really, what's changed the most for me in my teaching recently of statistics is be able to give my students opportunities to be creative and to see that data, or exploring data, is a creative process, and that really want to find ways to involve them, who they are, what they're interested in, and try and fuel their curiosity. So what I've decided to do instead is to provide a link up here to the talk that I gave, which does give a bunch of examples, but instead today focus on the student experience. And so for that reason, I'm actually going to get you to be like my students and give you a bunch of stuff to work through. So I'm not really going to talk at you for most of this talk. You're actually going to be doing some exploration of your own. And through that, I hopefully can try and get you to feel what I think it feels like for my students when we do data exploration. So I am drawing on material from my intro stats course. It's called Stats 100. It's a first stage course at the University of Auckland that I developed a few years ago. it's I'm sure many of you know, maybe through your children or through your own experiences, that students come to university wanting to do amazing subjects like psychology or business or environmental science, and then they realize that they actually have to do statistics as one of their core courses, and so they end up in a course like with me where they're not there because they want to be there, they're there because, you know, of course it's important, and my job is to help them realize that, of course, this is why statistics is one of the requisites for their degree, is because they're going to be having to learn from data. But I want to focus on the first week, and so the things that I do with my students to kind of try and create some first impressions of what it means to learn statistics. So if you think about my students, they come from a diverse range of disciplines. So I have psychology students, I have a range of other science students, I have business students, I have arts students as well. And so when I'm thinking about a data context, I need to think of a data context that all my students can connect to, and that one that doesn't require any specialist context knowledge. So it may not be a surprise to you that the context that I use is food. I mean, my students are still teenagers. They're typically 18 years old. I mean, they're really basically just year 13 students who have just gone to university. So they're not that different from your lovely year 13 students. And yeah, and so I use food initially as a way to get in and explore data. The data set that I kind of riff off, so my kind of inspo for this data exploration, is the food price index that Stats New Zealand puts out. They update it on a monthly basis, and they basically track a range of food items. They do some sampling, some surveying, and then they track on the average price of that food item, and then they update that data every month. So that's where we start. And so what we're going to do in this session is we're going to use breakout rooms. I'm going to put you into small groups of 4. I'm going to share some slides with you, some Google slides that are totally editable, so you'll go in and use those. And I'm going to take you through some of the explorations that I do with my students to try to get to know them in that first week and get them to realize that they can be part of stats and they can create and they can explore, fueled by their interests. So let's just make sure we've got everybody in. There's a few here in the waiting room, just jump them in. And what I'm going to do for you as well is I'm going to share for you in the chat box the first set of slides, just so you can open them up and make sure we've all got those before we get into it. So if you check the chat box for me now, why don't you all just jump into those slides? Don't type anything for now, but just so we've all got in there, I can see on the screen if you're there. All I'm going to get you to do in a moment is put you into groups of 4. What really works well in the breakout rooms is if one of you shares your screen in the breakout room, just so you've got like a common point of kind of discussion. And the slides you'll see, I'll just open them for you. I've set them up so that there's a slide for each group. So that group number is going to match the number that you have been assigned for the breakout room. Okay. So dealers, in a moment, I'll put you into breakout rooms. Look what number the breakout room is, go to that slide, get at least somebody from your group to share your screen. And all you're going to do for me in your groups is think about a meal that you like to eat with your friends or whānau, and a little bit about why you like it. Why is it a favorite meal for you? Then go online and find a recipe and copy the link to the recipe for that meal. And then just have a look at the ingredients for that recipe, and just tell me what's one of the main ingredients to make that recipe. So that's what you're going to be doing for me. So let me pop you into some breakout rooms. There we go. There we go. Okay, and I will see you in a little bit. For everyone to filter back in after I'm sorry to end your little group session. And I mean, you've got access to the slides as well, but just while I've got them open here, obviously we all know these tricks, don't we, from teaching online. Google Slides like this is fantastic. I can monitor what everyone's up to, even though I'm not there with you. So, you know, little hacks for us, isn't it? And just if you look through the slides now, because you've got them open in front of you as well, I think you can see why I do this. This is the first thing I ask students to do as an activity by themselves in the first week of teaching this course, and look across the diversity of what we're seeing, like all these different meals, all these different reasons why they like them. So straight away, students are choosing something. There's no stats or like context knowledge you have, it's just food. It's just food that you like to eat. there's no barriers in terms of like choosing what you want to focus on. And it's really, really great. Now you guys are a little bit shy, which I understand. You haven't told me your real reasons why you like this food. That's fine. That's fine. My students like this as well. Some of them are a little bit shyer than others. But yeah, so let me show you some examples from my students as well. Let me just pop that back on here. Okay, so there we go. So here's one example from one of my students in first semester this year, which I thought was really lovely. Little story about her mum's raw fish meal and how like she's a bit homesick. She's in a halls of residence. Hopefully not the halls of residence where we just found a COVID case. And then a little bit like about like missing being at home with her mum and her fish, raw fish. And it's kind of my sister-in-law also makes a really fantastic raw fish dish as well. So I was like, oh, I understand how you feel about this. So if you think about it from my perspective, I had nearly 200 students in my course, right? So I'm always trying to find ways to connect with my students and find a little bit about them. And so this first week, I really look forward to reading like this first part of their answer because I get to know a little bit about them. But also, it's not just that, I also get lots of really cool meal ideas. So here's just 5 different ideas of things that I have not made before, or I haven't made for a while, and some really cool reasons about why my students are into it. And I think you can already see immediately also the diversity of the students I teach as well, right? So you've got students talking about their dad's a beef farmer and that's why they're into mincemeat, and then they have to think about all the ways how to make stuff with it. Spanish seafood paella, like it's just really, really, really cool. Okay, so this is one of the first things I do to get students to say like, I can pick something, I can choose something, and I can make it about me, and this is totally cool. And then we go from there. So what are you going to do for me next is what you can do is, because Stats New Zealand publishes their data regularly, Figure NZ already makes plots about this data and updates them on a regular basis. So what I want you to do is for your ingredient that you've identified, your main ingredient, is if you head to Figure NZ, you should be able to find, if you put price, and then for example, if I put chocolate, because it's lockdown life, here we go, then you should be able to get a plot of the prices for that item, that food item, over the last 10 years. Now you might find at this point you might have to modify your ingredient. It may be that your ingredient's not one that's tracked by Stats New Zealand, and so you might have to go back and just pick another ingredient from your recipe. But what I want you to do is quickly find a plot. You can open it up, have a look at it, and just look at what's going on. And the other thing I want you to do with that, is I want you in your group to discuss the features of the plot. Now I don't mean the features of the data, we'll get to that later. I mean the features of the plot itself, the visualization. So what is it about how this data has been visualized that makes it informative to the viewer? Okay, so you're going to have a few plots between you because you've got different food items, or maybe you've got the same food item, it's fine. And the same thing, I'm going to share some slides with you now that'll give you a space just to jot some notes for me. And all you're doing is going to Figure NZ, finding out that plot. I would also probably advise that you have a look down here and just have a little bit of a read about the data. It's a little bit of information about how they find this data, where it comes from. It's kind of obviously important to know how the data is collected. But focus on not the features of the data, but the features of the visualization for me. Okay, so same thing as before. Here is another Google slide for you. So I'll give you a chance to open that up so that we've all got that in front of us. And let me go back here as well, because I can also see with all those anonymous foxes, anonymous whatever they are at the top, how many people are in there at that point. Here we go, I've got 8, 9, okay. So I'll just let you have a chance to open that in the chat box, and then I will put you back into your breakout rooms.
Anna, we weren't able to share our screens before. It's disabled.
Oh, is it? Okay,
yeah.
Let me change. Good, thank you. It's because I have like super settings so that my students can't do things. So let me change that now. Okay, you should be able to once you're in your breakout room. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've got that set up. You're in there. You know what your group number is from before. And let me pop you back into your rooms. And there's a few new people, but you'll welcome them, I'm sure, if they've come in a little bit later. Let me just find, where am I? Sorry, breakout rooms. Here we go. Okay, off you go. Kia ora, welcome back. I'm sorry that wasn't very long. I can see in the Google Slides that there weren't probably enough time to write any serious notes, but I hope you had a bit of a chat about some of the features that you were seeing. And one of the reasons for this is that one of the objectives in the first week of my course also is to talk a little bit about data visualization and the ways that we try to communicate with visualizations. And time series is a nice one to start with because you are able to easily find a lot of time series plots being shared around. They're quite common data viz that they'll see. So I can see some really cool ideas in the Google Slides about things that you were noticing about the plots. Some things that I pull out for my students just so you can see here, that I can see a lot of you were noticing as well, is that you have this subtitle, this title at the top, and it's a very sort of simple title. It's just telling you that basically this time series plot is about the price of beef mince, basically in New Zealand. And you have to be careful with your Graphicacy and look at the subtitle to see that you've also got a little bit more information, right? Oh, this is for a kilogram of beef. And also it's this thing called a weighted average. You know, what is that? That you've got this time period that the data is being collected and being shown for, and that's also in New Zealand dollars. All right, so these are all important bits of information in terms of interpreting this data, that we know the data source is Stats New Zealand. Some of you are looking at the axes as well, so we can see here that the axes are using breaks of $5, which is important if we're going to try to read any values off this time series plot. And then along the bottom, we have a numeric variable in terms of what we're tracking, but we're tracking it over time, and then we've got like a date time variable along the bottom. In this case here, we've got June's being pulled out as like the labels for those axes. And one of the things that like I always find with my students at the start of the course, and I'm sure you've found this as well, is that if I ask my students, oh, how often is this data being collected? They'll say yearly. And they'll say yearly because the axis is going up in years. And I'm like, no, it's not yearly, it's monthly data. Like you can see that there's like, 12 little kind of like, movements here between each year. But it's something that you kind of like, we have to keep on impressing on our students, is to take some time to have a look at all the features and look at how it's been labeled, so that you actually can start to interpret the features of this data. I saw some people comment on the fact that there was some interactivity, which is really awesome. So on the figure NZ side, if you move your mouse over the curve, you can see the different prices appear, which is really, really cool. And I also obviously am interested in the idea of a line graph as a way that we can represent time series. It's not the only way, but just as a way that we can get started with it. All right, so I saw some people already starting to do this already, but the next couple of slides we're going to do a little bit faster because it's probably things that you're more familiar with in terms of exploring time series data. But just to give you a little bit of a taste of what happens next with my students, is that I say to them, well, first of all, look, what are some ways that we can improve this visualization? For example, in terms of reading off any values of the prices, it's a little bit tricky at the moment because the axis is going up by $5. So it makes it a little bit difficult to read off these values here, if we're reading it from the plot, of course, if we don't have access to the raw data, which we do. And that, yeah, that's kind of the main thing in terms of like reading off the data, but if there's anything else that they could improve. So for example, it doesn't say the data's monthly anywhere. I guess it's implied because it's got June's, but it could be that they just record every June. So maybe even if in the subtitle, it had made it clear that it was monthly data as well, would be kind of helpful, possibly. Okay, so why did you, what was the point of that recipe? What was to give students a focus for one of these particular time series plots, and then to get them to do a little bit of exploring of the data, and in particular, just a little bit of description about the features of that data. So same thing as before, I'm going to give you some slides. In this case here, we'll just do it really quickly. I think actually, rather than put it into the slides, what would be kind of cool is if you just discuss these two things verbally in your group. So you've got two things you want to do. One is just describe how does the price of that ingredient change over the time period? And is there anything else interesting about the features of those prices? And so you'll notice, you probably will notice because you're all stats teachers, I haven't used the T word, I haven't said trend. I'm just trying to informally get some ideas here. So really, I'm just interested in how have the prices changed? Just tell me how the prices have changed. And I want to see what students come out with before I kind of maybe tidy up some of the details of it. So yeah, so just maybe just verbally, rather than me sharing the slides, if that's okay. So you all know what your ingredient is. You've all had a chance to look at it on Figure NZ. So what you could do is maybe just have someone share their screen, bring up the plot on Figure NZ, and then just have a bit of a chat, even if you do one or two of these ingredients. All right, welcome back. I am sorry for these short things. The other thing I am known for, if you've been to my workshops before, is for over planning. Always too much content into a 1 hour session. So I want to get to something that's a little bit different. So I'm going to skip over a couple of things. I'm going to show you how it works, but it's only the one I'm skipping over that I feel like will be a little bit more familiar for you than the other ones. Okay, so the idea here is that obviously we want students to explore that time series data, describe some features, and of course think about it. They've got their own ingredient, their own recipe that this is within. What this is building up to is is this idea that we can then try to predict how much it'll cost to make this meal in a year's time. So doing some informal sort of sketching predictions to see, how the cost of this ingredient will change in a year's time. I want to point one thing out to you before we do that, or if I show you how I do that. I'm not going to give you the chance to do it yourself, I'm sorry, but it's just to show you, this is the Figure NZ plot here. Now in my course, my students actually get to access the data and make the plot of the food prices themselves. And so what the code that we use actually, that I gave them, so this is in semester 1, we decided to focus on data only from 2016. And what I won't bring up this example is that I remember sitting with the student and helping them with their work on this, and they were tracking the price of rice. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so interesting that the price of rice has like increased over, towards the end of 2019 and through 2020. But then when I brought up the same plot on Figure NZ, I was like, oh, I don't get that feeling. But of course, it's because you can see the differences in how these have been created. And it's just to point out to students that when you make a visualization, that humans also make decisions about what to do with that visualization. And so even though these are both time series plots, how we decide to visualize something then impacts how we might interpret the features of that data. So for example, with Figure NZ, they have like an automated process of creating their plots. And so they've decided to always use 0, to always have the axes go from 0, which means you end up with the time series data being squished in like this. Whereas when I made these plots, I was like, oh, we'll just make the plot, the axes fit our data. And also we'll just track the data from December 2015. And so you can see, even though those are the same data, you're like, when you look at the features of the plots, you might visualize or interpret those in different ways. And it's just worth pointing out to our students that we also have to be careful about what design choices have been made when data is visualized as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you what happens next, but I give you the idea of what happens and you can do this yourself later. But I asked them to then try to predict what the mean price of that ingredient will be a year from now. So when I was doing it with my students, it was a year from December. For you, it would have been a year from now, from when the last time the data was updated, which was June 2021. And so how I do that, if I just exit out of my slides for a second, is we don't use any modeling at all. This is the first week of the course. It's that first week introduction, just getting them in. As I get them to actually use a Google slide, like what we were in before, I get them to take the scribble tool here, and I make them, first of all, take their mouse and trace over the past data. And this is really, really important, because the physical act of tracing over the data with their mouse helps them feel like the data. So in this case here, if I'm tracing over, I'm feeling that these are just random fluctuations. There's no pattern to these ups and downs. It just feels like I'm just doing just a jittery mess. And then I get to the end and I get here. And then the idea is that you just keep jittering it. And one thing that's really important about it is that this is just them having a go. There's no strict rules to it. The idea is that it kind of like their hand is basically they're training their model on like their hand movements. And that this thing like this sketch here has the same feature of the variation in it. So rather than thinking about like drawing arrows or like straight lines through it, that I actually encourage them to like try to keep the features of the data, which is the uncertainty, the variation, as well as this kind of like recent downwards trend. And then just use that to predict into the future. And then what we would do is just say, well, a year from now is about there. let's draw a vertical line up. And then that becomes, where those two intersect, that becomes our informal prediction for what how much that item will cost in a year's time. And it's really interesting because I've been doing this for a couple of years. It means that every year when I come back to this part of my course, I can update the data and show students that, in fact, actually, my like hand-drawn, just like informal sketches actually have worked really well for the last two like iterations, last 2 years of predictions. They've been pretty close to what the prices ended up being. And the students always comment on it, that like they're so fascinated that, in fact, actually, just by learning from the data themselves and tracing that pattern, they actually get pretty good predictions, even without doing any formal modeling. And that's just kind of what I want in the first week, is for them to realize that they can model things, like they know what they're trying to do, and we can get some intuition for it before we then move into some more formal modeling. So that's just behind that. And this is a nice kind of carry on point that they started with their recipe, they use a bit of data, they predict how much that ingredient will cost their recipe. And that's a nice kind of like introduction to exploring some time series data. But we also use this context into something a little bit different about reasoning with data, which is to look at images as a source of data as well. So what you are going to do for this one here is, well, maybe what's the time? Maybe I'll just show you how this works. But I'm going to repurpose an app I already have, which is called a popularity contest app here. And so the idea behind this is that my students will go in and search for 20 photos of one of their group's ingredients, or they're doing it by themselves. So they'll be searching for their ingredient themselves. And then what I ask them to do is try to come up with 2 different categorical variables that they could record or measure or like classify these photos by, and then to rearrange these photos based on those categorical variables, use that to come up with a 2-way table of counts, and then from that 2-way table of counts, create and use 2 different kinds of percentages or proportions in a sentence. So they can use that table however they want to tell me what they've learned about the photos of this food item. So if I show you how this works, this is an app I've had up for a while, and what this does is it goes in and it searches for photos from a website called Pixabay, which is a photo sharing website. And so, for example, if I was to put in the word banana, let's say that was one of my main ingredients, and search for a sample size of 20, then what's going to happen is it's going to go to the website, it's going to find 20 photos of that come up when you search for bananas, and you'll get them here. And so this site here is set up for something else. I'm just repurposing it because you can drag these photos around. This is the main thing. And so what I do with students is in lectures, we might do some activities like this to kind of get them into the gist of things. So for example, I might, like in front of them, like I am with you now, I might start sorting the photos here. In the chat box for me, I'm now just sorting into 2 groups. Okay, so in the chat box for me, tell me if you can work out how I'm sorting my 2 groups. And pop it in the chat box. So I've got one group on the left, one group on the right. Any ideas how you think I am sorting my photos? Have a look in the chat box. You can see bananas, raw versus cooked banana based on where there is in the dish, raw ingredient, processed ingredient, raw versus cooked. Yeah, and this is kind of cool because what I'm trying to show is there's so many ways that we can think about creating categorical variables from images, and that they've got a lot of choice in here in what they decide. So I think my brain, this is what my brain was thinking, was that I was going like, can you see like the whole banana, right, basically, versus, you know, the banana shape, you know, like, I think that's what I was thinking. So like you can actually kind of see the whole banana versus some sort of part of it. So that would be like one categorical variable that I've decided to sort it on. And then what I would do next is try to come up with a second one that goes with it. And this one here, I practiced this before this talk, by the way, and this is a different random sample of photos. So what I had planned is what I'm seeing now, which is kind of interesting. I guess what happens with random samples, isn't it? But what I might do, I don't know, maybe I would then do this. So have a look now. I'm creating a second variable. No, I'm not. There. What do you think? Maybe I'm making my set. Oh, that one's got a whole banana. Let's move back there. What do you think? Maybe I'm possibly making my second variable based on? Chuck it in the chat box for me. You think what I'm doing? I think that's about right. No, there we go. Any ideas? Let's have a look. Breakfast versus bananas. I don't know if this is a recent one or not. This was maybe a little bit too obscure, but I think here what I was trying to do, I think there was one more on here. Cut. Yeah, I was trying to do ones that were cut. Yeah, cut versus not. There we go. So the idea here is that you naturally, by reorganizing these photos, you naturally get like a two-way table here of banana, whole banana versus not banana as like your rows, and then whole banana versus not banana as your column, sorry, and like whether it's not cut or whether it's cut as your columns. And so I give the students the chance again to again, they choose their food ingredients, so they've got that control in terms of their curiosity, and then they also now have to come up with their own variables to classify these images, and then that gets turned into a two-way table. And then from that, they tell me some proportions. But I might say, for example, here that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 35% of the photos in this sample or in this group of photos featured like the whole banana. And I make them write those sentences for me. And I just ask them to write me one that's about like an overall proportion and one that's about a conditional proportion. And from that, I can see if they're able to reason with the two-way table. But again, it's come from them doing a bit of something fun with sorting some images and coming up with the categorical variables themselves. So some examples from that, just to quickly show you here. I actually also use it with book covers. So this is an example of a similar thing where they've sorted some book covers. The books are searched by completely different subjects. I can't remember what the subjects were for these two students, but they both have noticed that maybe the book covers have images or not on the front of them. I think I might have demoed that one in like a lecture. So often, like obviously they often do things that are similar to what you've demoed, but then they've looked at like the title, and the students talked about whether the title's at the top of the page or the middle or the bottom of the page of the cover. And the students talked about whether the title is capitalized or uncapitalized. And so it's just really cool. Again, like I get this huge variety of students' work. They choose what they're doing, their variables, and then they end up again choosing how they want to write two different sentences where they use proportions from these tables to say what they've learned about these books, which is really, really cool. Okay, so let's do the thing that will unite our recipes together to finish off this talk, which is to go back and have a look at your online recipe. So you've got your computers, just pull it up again, have a look at your recipe. We'll do this one together because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So here's the recipe of my students, which was the marinated raw fish in coconut cream. So you'll have your recipe on your webpage, and it's really cool that we've got a variety of web pages out there. And there's a bunch of sites that do recipes. And depending on what kind of recipe you're trying to find, it might be a more specialized recipe website as well. So this one's, I think, a pretty big one, food.com. So what we're looking at here is all the different ways, what data could we pull from these recipes that we could combine from across all of our recipes into one data set. So have a bit of a look here. If you've got some ideas, just pop them in the chat box. So what kind of things could we pull off from this recipe and create some variables or some data that we could combine across all of our recipes? If you've got some ideas, just pop them in the chat box for me, and I'll show you a little bit where I got to. So we've got amount of gradients, so how many ingredients there are. That's cool. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 ingredients on mine, I think. Yeah. Anything else? I'll just think of it. Maybe you're just thinking of lunch right now. Savory versus sweet, whether it has liquids, most commonly used ingredients, time to prepare. Yeah. How many people it feeds. Yeah, fantastic. And so what we're pulling out is a bunch of different variables that might be numeric, that might be categorical, But what we've got to decide is which of these variables, because we're going to crowdsource this across all of our different recipes that have come from different websites. What are some things that we have in common that might feature on some people's websites, but not on other people's websites, if we want to kind of combine this together. So you guys can keep popping in there. I'll show you what something I prepared earlier to be all recipe planning, is these options here. So one thing would be the actual URL to your recipe. The other one, I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of these recipes have like an image of the recipe, and we can actually download that and we can upload that image. So that's why the activity I did with you before about looking at sorting the photos of food was like a primer for this, so that we could also think about the recipe image as something that we could extract data from as well in terms of variables. We've got the title, how many words are in the title, like someone was saying, number of ingredients. Often, depending on your recipe, it'll tell you how long it takes to prepare the recipe, but also how long it takes you to cook the recipe. There often is something to do with like how difficult or hard it is, like is it easy or hard to make? And if that's not provided on the recipe, then you might have to do a bit of a judgment call yourself. And then you can pick out things like this. So I might pick out, is it red meat? Is that one of the ingredients or not? And then here for servings groups, because I know this data pretty well, I've gone ahead and decided to make that a categorical variable where I'm going to say, does it serve up to 4 people or does it serve more than 4 people? And so just up here, these are things I reminded myself, is that I've set up the Google form for this. And the kind of idea behind it is that then we crowdsource this data together. One of the things I've done is in a Google form, you can use response validation. So for example, if I show you the questions in here, under recipe title, number of words, if I go in here, under these little butts here, I've done response validation here. There we go. And so I've said that it has to be a number. In this case here, recipe title, number of words, it would have to be a number that's greater, than 0 there, right? Or I could say 1 or more, right? And this just stops from students from entering in like words with numbers. And so we can, I've set this form up, so I'm demonstrating it to students, but it's good for them to see that you can actually try to preempt some data from being entered that might be not helpful later on by using some of the response validation options. But also when I've defined my categorical variable here, I've also made a point that the levels of that categorical variable aren't yes or no, because if you end up with too many categorical variables that say yes or no, when you start visualizing or exploring your data, you get lots of yes or no's, and it's really hard for the students to tie that back to what the actual yes or no was for. So here, rather than saying like difficult yes or no, I've put easy or hard as the options for it. And I've made sure here an example to show something like servings group, which would be numeric, that it actually, in this case here, I've turned it into a categorical variable by grouping it. Yeah. So the idea here is that I would maybe start off with some variables that I think work. Then there's the option here from across the students to crowdsource some more. So if we could come up with some other options of things that we might want to include in our survey, we can do that together. And then we can put it out to the class, and everyone can go through and enter in what they can for their recipe item. So I know we're running a little bit out of time, but let me just pop in the form. If you've got, here's the form I set up that has those same questions. So what you could try to do for me is to see whether you can enter in some of those answers for your particular recipe into that form, or save that form for later, and you can maybe pop in later and put it in if you want to. But the idea behind it, just to skip through some things here, because like I said before, I'm so terrible. You would think being a lecturer where I have 50-minute lectures, I would have got better of this over time, but such is my life, is that we would collect that data together, and then that would give us a really cool data set to explore with students. It's come from them, it's come from their recipe, it represents like our group, and we've also together come up with some variables and on top of the ones that maybe I've started with for us to explore. And what that gives us is a really cool opportunity to explore data. And this diagram here is just to point out that when we think about statistics and learning from data, there's two very different modes of learning from data. On the left-hand side, I have a confirmatory data analysis. This is an example where you would start with some sort of question or hypothesis that you investigate. It's a focused investigation. So you have a question, you get some data, you do some what's called initial data analysis, where you look at the data, but then it's on the way to making a call or using a method like a confidence interval or a randomization test to reach a conclusion. Okay, and so this is confirmatory data analysis. The step here where we look at the data is not EDA, it's only initial data analysis. It's not kind of an open exploration where you're free to create and kind of like, yeah, just look across a bunch of data. It's only within this focused investigation where you start with a problem or a hypothesis. What I'm trying to get to in this first week of my course, and the first weeks of my course, I should say, is exploratory data analysis. This is what really exploring data is. It starts with data, starts with getting to know that data, and then it starts with doing a bunch of iterations of saying, what's my question? What do I see in the data? Let's make a plot or calculate something. Did I get what I expected? Let's go back. I've got more questions. Let's go around and around and around lots and lots of times and explore this data. And what that comes out with is it's generated from data, starts with data, and it's a process of generating questions, searching for answers, going back and doing more questions. It's not a formal process with a strict set of rules. And it says here it's a state of mind. It's a state of mind. And so this idea that there's no rules and that you can ask, there's no rule about what questions you ask during EDA is something I know that's a little bit scary, but also could possibly be even like kind of exciting. That it really would be, if we had this data here, let's see if we've got any results in here at all. I've got 2 results, but imagine this, but this sheet is populated with a bunch of data. We don't know what to expect. We just collected it. It is surprising to us. There's so much we can learn from it. We should get in there and we should create a range of different plots and see what we can learn from them. Questions, what's going on, what can we plot next? And from across a range of different visualizations, a range of different plots, come out with a story about the recipes that our class likes, you know, our class or our group likes to eat, and what do we learn about our class through these recipes? So to piece those all together. So that's what I would have done. We would have got our data together. We would have, I would have given it back to you. I would have given you a chance to just explore it, just go nuts, just try out all the plots, all the combinations, have a look, see what you could find out. And then maybe select 4 of those plots and pull those together to tell a story, and tell me why you made those plots and what you learned from that plot about the recipes of our class. I've chosen 4, don't read too much into that. That's not like there's a rule that there has to be 4 or anything. My activities are designed for my students to do within like an hour by themselves. And so that just seems to work. It's not like a hard and fast rule at all. It just seems to work for me. So yeah, so the idea is that all of my activities in this course have this kind of vibe to it, where I start with something as simple like choosing a recipe. And from that, students then get to choose a version of the data that's based on that. And from that, they do a bunch of explorations around that common idea. So if you do have a look at that talk, I've got the slides at the beginning. You're going to see a bunch of other ones here. So I did the same thing with things from songs from Spotify, movies from OMDB, YouTube channels or Google Books. Like these are all the kinds of data and landscapes that we do explore in a certain way like this. And that also, that to do some of these things does require a little bit more computational thinking, a little bit more computational skills. And so if you're interested in the sort of data science side of it, then that's something definitely to watch out for. And it can go further. We can go into social media data. We can use that as a source of data as well. And I'll be doing a little bit more about this at NZAMP if you are fortunate enough to be able to go down there. But I'll also bring some of it back for our Stats Teachers Day at the beginning, or sorry, the end of November as well. So yeah, so in summary, what I really also think is so awesome about giving students a chance to bring themselves and choose their options for their data here is not just the data landscapes, which are these contexts where they can provide freedom to explore, but with like some sort of necessary safety travel restrictions. So there is like some structure, but there's still options to explore. But that I get to be like a travel guide, right? So because I've got nearly 200 students, but because they're all choosing their own paths, I feel more freed up to give advice and guidance because they're not all doing the same thing. It's not all the same spreadsheet or data source. And so I am able to act like a travel guide where I give them advice and guidance and how to keep safe on the journeys through their data. It's really important to have this idea of like a travel journal. So we want to see what they tried out, what worked, what didn't work. We don't just want to see that they got to the destination and they just can do the final thing. We want to see what they did along the way. You know, what kind of things did they learn in the process? And one of the things that's I've really learned a lot is I don't need to see that much in terms of writing, actually. Think of it like a postcard. Like you do your travel journals, you keep track of everything, but then you write just the best bits, like a little postcard, just the most important ideas of what you found from this journey through this data. And the other really, really important thing is to ask for travel reviews. So I ask my students to do a personal reflection, not about necessarily about like the investigation or the exposure itself, but like, what did you find personally interesting? What did you learn? What else do you want to learn more about? And what things about the world are you now more curious about? And this stuff is as important as them showing me any statistical understanding as well. Well, that's my belief anyway. So yes, so anyway, this is possibly a road less traveled, but I would highly encourage it. I just can't stress enough that the huge diversity in what my students select when I give them a choice. I have 2 of these tasks every week for 12 weeks. That's 24 tasks over 200 students. That's thousands and thousands of different adventures that I get to read about. I don't have any issues with authenticity because they are choosing their own paths. I get to learn so much stuff from my students. It's fun and interesting to see what they're choosing and why. And this whole idea is that at the core of learning from data is that we need some structure, but it's about variation. It's explorations and variation. We want to see this diversity and this variation. Things don't always go like you expect because you don't have a fixed data set, right? So if you give students options, maybe their data set's not very big, maybe it's large, maybe they have tech issues. But the thing is, I found my students have been so understanding because they like being tourists. They like the idea that they get to make choices. So we're sometimes a little bit worried about whether students can cope with all these things. Maybe it should just be one tool, like one spreadsheet, one thing, but that's not my experience at all. If you give them some chance to be creative and curious, they actually it's fine if some things don't always work, we can sort it out. And the most important thing for me is that it's allowed me to be someone who's an adaptable personal like tour guide. And I feel so much happier teaching in this way than when I was only providing a single static spreadsheet with my students. So yeah, so that's my my last words for you. I'm sorry I've gone sort of right to the end of the time, but these slides will be shared. And of course, you're welcome to make contact with me as well. My email is on the slides as well, and you'll also see me around at some other days coming out soon as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. There have been some questions in the chat. You might be able to have a look at some of those. I think people were quite interested in the way that you deliver a lesson like, well, if you call this a lesson, but a presentation like this to us, and they found some of the tools you were using great. So I think at least for them, they've seen some stuff and they can go and research how to do that a little bit. But to talk about the talk and a little bit wider, really impressed and always enjoy these. I think one of my takeaways is the sort of whakawhanaungatanga aspect of letting people learn about each other and the teacher learning about their students through a really, I guess, easy context that the students can get into. So that's something that I think we could all learn a little bit from. But I won't keep people any longer. Thank you so much for your time, Anna. Thank you so much to the participants for being here and interacting, and you did keep us interacting. Just have to put up one quick slide. So the couple things that are coming up. We hopefully will still have the session in some way. It was supposed to be face-to-face, the September 11 one. It was supposed to be a games focus where teachers would learn about some games and play some games together and build that community. We'll see how it goes. So we'll keep you posted on that. Also got Lisa Dara talking at that one about the decisions that we make in games and other things and how that can affect people's mathematical identities. Next term, I'm looking to have another one of these AMAonlines. November the 6th is the date on that, and still looking to have our wonderful stats day, which I know is a big part of, and our maths and calc day. They are not back to back this year, but they're pretty close. So November 29th and December the 2nd for those. So once again, thank you to all participants and thank you to our speaker, Anna Ferguson.